Welcome back to Building Process. I had a new idea for a show based on my experience getting an oil change the other day and always being upsold to use synthetic oil in my car. And I thought it would be cool to do a synthetic listener questions podcast. And so what do I mean by that? I had some LLMs, a couple different LLMs, generate 10 listener questions with fake listener names and go through some of the material we've already done and expand on that. So that'd be a cool idea, especially as the show is still pretty small, but also something to practice, something to use, and something to mine the archive for more of the evergreen content that we do try to produce with this show. So a little bit about it. If you want to check us out on YouTube, it's youtube.com/@buildingprocess. You can see that right here. If you're watching the screencast, buildingprocess.substack.com. And yeah, we're creating evergreen content for people trying to improve operations, trying to build out their processes. That is the purpose of the show. And the idea is to be agnostic to tools and the technology waves, but really talk about building out operations in a strategic and smart way, and just really giving you playbooks for different things that you can just take and roll right into your operation, whatever it is, a business, a non-for-profit, a household, a government agency, you name it. These are things that you can use to your advantage. And my hope is to have this library available so that when people ask me questions about these things, as opposed to redoing the same demonstration over and over again, I can say, here's a look at that exact thing that you're looking for. Here's a look at IT onboarding. Here's a look at scheduled expense review. Here's a look at contract to hire. These different things that we talk about. So I've got a lot of items in the queue, but let's kick off with some synthetic listener questions. I'm going to do a little pause right before it just so I can be prepped for the answer. And then with the ones that do need some modeling as well, we'll get the visualization or the LLMs out to talk through the answer to the question. All right, so first up, we've got Marcus from Atlanta. And his question is, I inherited a department with 0 documented processes. Where do I even start without overwhelming my team or grinding operations to a halt? So this is an issue always, getting buy-in from people when you're just trying to establish a new baseline. And moving a team away from chaos into process-driven workflows is going to be hardest to do the first one. That's going to be the big lift that you have. And so my recommendation is to find something that everybody thinks is broken and that nobody really enjoys, nobody really is fond of, and that's the thing that you target. And in my experience, this has often been something that is fairly boring, right? Something like in the finance world, sales tax is a great example. Nobody really takes a lot of pride in that. Nobody is really excited to deal with it. It's tedious. There's a lot of work. Nobody hangs their hat on that as the guy or the girl who is really good at dealing with the sales tax problem. There are people who specialize in it, obviously, but in your average finance department, it's not a coveted topic. And that's a place where you can demonstrate your value, because you can say, look, we don't like this thing that much, but I'm going to build a process around it and show you how this thing can get better. And then you can slowly level up. So instead of attacking some of the biggest, most glamorous opportunities, you're actually going to go with some of the least glamorous opportunities. And that way, you're going to be able to start demonstrating your ability, particularly in these areas that nobody's really territorial about, nobody's really fighting over, nobody really has a strong feeling about it. So definitely go for the lower rated items, if you will. Okay, next we have Priya from Chicago. How do you balance process standardization with giving employees autonomy? I don't want to create a compliance prison. Yeah, this is a big question. Oftentimes, the people who ask this question are already angling to try and get around the process on their own. So sometimes I find this to be a disingenuous ask from certain employees or other managers who already want to get out of doing the process. But there is a relevant piece here. There's an element to it that I think you need to think about. What I think about is, where is someone's special artisanal quality, right? And sometimes it's easier to get this out of the workplace, but you want to think about a chef, a famous chef who's famous for certain dishes, right? The last thing in the world that you want to make process-oriented is their special way that they cook that dish that they're known for, right? The special way that they flame broil the steaks, right? If that's their specialty in the steakhouse. You want to make sure that that thing is filled with autonomy and filled with ways for them to express themselves and put themselves into their work. But then you want to take the more banal and boring things and stuff that tends to get, swept under the rug, like what time do we clean the kitchen? or who orders ingredients every evening, right? Who makes sure our morning order is ready at the market? How are we going to do checks of the temperature of the meat in the morning? All these things that are just a bit more boring, a little less artisanal, a little less focused on that special skill. That's the area where you're going to be able to make the biggest impact with process. And now you're telling all your people, I think this is very motivating too, to just say, look, you have a lot of autonomy in the thing that you're incredibly good at and the thing that you're incredibly passionate about. Go, do it, be great, right? The best salespeople, go, build relationships with your customers. But when you're putting data into the CRM, here's how we do it. Here's the standard way we do it, right? So a lot of what you're doing is you're taking these second to third tier tasks and you're focused on those being the process areas. And then in that artisanal zone, you're giving them a lot of autonomy. So I think that's the split that you want to look for. And then the only other place I would say that it's good to consider autonomy as an option is where you have a new process and you're not entirely sure how things need to go, and you've got one or two people you can rely on to actually help you build that. Give them a lot of autonomy to just do it as they're defining it, and that's a way you can help develop buy-in for your new processes as well. All right, we got Rob from Kansas City. Can you take a real example of a manual process and show where you'd stop short of automating it, even if automation is technically possible? I have a great one for this, one that I talk a lot about, in part because there's just so little literature on it, and I think maybe that's a reason for me to be the person who writes the literature. But what I would go with is collections. Collections is something that we could very easily automate, especially now with some of the AI callers. We could do a lot of our collections work in an automated fashion, vis-a-vis the emails we're sending out or the call notifications we're doing. The problem is there's a lot of context involved with that. And when you're selling larger tickets, as we do, we're in a B2B sales type of situation, I think it's just a lot more caution should be used about the way you're engaging with the customers about paying their bills. And then there's just a million different cases that happen. So it's an area where I think you want to have a steady hand, still a process-driven hand, but a steady hand, a human involved in that collections process. So it's something that we thought about automating. We have certain automated notifications that go out. Hey, your invoice is due. Your invoice is 3 days overdue. Those kind of things. But the phone call, the dealing with the specifics of it, the dealing with the giving them a little extra time, that's all something where you want to have a human being being in the mix, being manual about it, and them not feeling like they're just part of some kind of collections mailing list. And I also think on top of that, you're triggering a bit of an emotional response, which is that they actually don't want to disappoint the human on the other end of the line, but most people would be totally fine disappointing some kind of AI bot who's either writing emails or calling them. So collections is a great example of where I would not automate despite the ability to do it quite easily. All right, Kevin from Phoenix writes, our onboarding process is decent, but offboarding is a disaster. People leave and still have access to systems for months. Where do I start fixing this? Yeah, we talked about this too in the offboarding episode, that there's really an asymmetric situation with onboarding and offboarding. On one hand, you want to get onboarding right because that person still works with you, and a bad first impression is a bad first impression. Offboarding, it's easy to feel like, this isn't that important because this person's not going to work here anymore. What's ironic is the risk to a poor offboarding is so much higher than the risk to a poor onboarding. The person who's poorly onboarded, and I think I talked about this in the episode, they're going to figure out what they need to do eventually. It's going to be a slog, and they may lose some respect for you in the process, but they're going to get there. But the person who's offboarded poorly and maybe systems are missed, that's a huge liability for your company, right? So this is an area where people, I think, do the exact opposite of what they should do in terms of a risk orientation. I think, right now, this is a checklist problem, and you want to get on top of this. Assuming you're the person in charge of the offboarding, you want to get right on top of this and do some stress tests around it, right? Call up old employees if you still have relationships with them, ideally people you didn't have to terminate. Hey, can you get into this system? Can you try this for me? I want you to see if you still have access to this. Just have them start running through it and have a checklist that goes through all the things that you should be doing. The other thing I would say is start thinking about access management as more of an integrated thing. So a lot of the benefits we get from an identity provider like Google Workspace helps us to cut off access at a single point as opposed to having a million different points of failure. Still a couple systems that don't integrate with it, so there's always things that you have to figure out, but that's another thing I'd recommend, is just really trying to think of access as a singular problem that is then proxied out to a whole load of different systems, and that way you don't have to offboard 50 different checkpoints on your checklist. You probably have to offboard 5 to 10, and one of them is a really big one, right? So that's another helpful way to do it from the tool perspective. But definitely take this seriously. This is one of the biggest vectors for risk Main Street businesses notwithstanding, if you're in tech, if you're remote, if you work in software as I do, this is pretty much it. This is where your risk lies. Your risk lies in cybersecurity, either at the platform level or at the employee level. And so anything you can do to mitigate that is a big deal. This is where all the disasters happen in this kind of line of work. All right, Sarah from Seattle writes, we want employees to do continuous learning, but they're already stretched thin. How do you make continuing education work without it feeling like homework? Yeah, this is a big one. And I think I've never seen an organization that really truly solved this. At the end of the day, it's going to be up to the employees. You have a certain kind of person, and I put myself in this category, who are just independently motivated to seek education. And part of that is an orientation towards learning as being a high value. Now, somebody who doesn't believe learning is as high value, it's not a moral proclamation about them. It's just maybe they get joy from other things. Maybe they get joy from relationship. Maybe they get joy from novel experiences, you name it. But people who place learning as a very high value will always try and have some kind of learning goal for themselves. And so you'll see those people on your team independently motivated to seek this out, and they'll be the tougher one, or the easier one, I should say, to get to do this. Now, I think there's a middle ground. If you think of like that group is maybe 20% who's always going to be motivated towards their own continuing education, and then maybe there's another group, let's say the vast middle, the 60% who probably needs some continuing education but isn't going to have that motivation. What kind of systems are we going to use to get them into it? I think one of the biggest ones is you got to make the time and budget available. So you can't have them all working 50-hour weeks and just expect them to kind of squeeze this in somehow without giving them any leeway for it. And then the other thing beyond the time and budget is you got to have some kind of expectation, right? So there is a incentive for them to do it. I took an exam years ago. It was a CFA exam vis-a-vis my employer at the time, and they paid for all my training materials and the test itself, which is quite expensive. But here's the deal: you had to pass it. And that was everything I needed to be motivated, because otherwise I was looking at close to a $10,000 bill to myself if I didn't pass the test. So there's ways you can motivate. That's a pretty strong incentive, but there's other ones where you could say, look, I expect you to take this and then this continuing education, and you're going to have these responsibilities going forward starting on this date after the completion of this class, right? So if they don't actually learn the material, then they're not going to be able to fulfill the responsibilities, and it's going to show up in performance. So definitely always have that end point that you have to incentivize them, and then you have to give them the time and you have to give them the budget to do it. The idea that you just expect them to go, like I said, only those independently motivated learners will do it, and that's great, but it's not something you can depend on. It's not a system. It's not a process. That's not what we talk about on this show, which is relying on the system, relying on the process rather than this customization and people's personality and their heroism in these things. People have a million different things going on. You have to create the space for them to prioritize it. Otherwise, don't be surprised when they don't. Okay, James from Cleveland says, demonstrate how you take feedback from 5 different stakeholders who all hate the current process and turn that into a coherent improvement proposal. Okay, so first of all, you're already on the right side of this. If you know that they already hate the current process, you at least can get some traction. Oftentimes, this is much more difficult when, say, 2 of the 5 or 3 of the 5 actually like the current process or don't know any better, and then you have a change management problem that you have to deal with. But in this particular case, let's say that you have the 5 different stakeholders. They all hate it, but they maybe have different perspectives on where it should arrive. What I would start with is receiving, doing a bit of a listening tour with all of them and just make sure you're addressing their concerns. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen someone complain about something and then the person who's on the other side of it implementing some kind of solution assumes they already know what the main concern is, and they don't. They haven't actually figured out what the problem is. They've made an assumption. So there's just a lot of value to going in and asking them, hey, what is your actual issue with this? What problem am I trying to solve? Not only do you get a better detail of what you're trying to do, but you're also going to get more buy-in. They're going to believe you actually tried to solve their problem instead of solve the different problem that you wanted to deal with. The other thing, too, is I'm looking for the Venn diagram between the 5. Where are the areas of agreement that I can get my POC out the door, right? So if, we've got all these stakeholders, we talked about this earlier in the episode, but talking about sales tax, right? And one person has an issue with the calculation and another person has an issue with the filings. That's not the place to target, but maybe everyone is in agreement that what we really have an issue with is missing our deadlines, right? So we have a problem with actually enough time set aside for this kind of thing. So figure out where you want to make the POC just based on where's the zone of agreement. And then as you're bringing these people along, you're demonstrating your ability to listen, to solve their problems, and then they're going to accept riskier and riskier things from you, including ideas that they don't necessarily sign off on. So that's it. Figure out that Venn diagram of agreement, and then move forward on those things first. Build that POC. Don't feel like you need the full waterfall solution. All right, Emily from Portland says, what's your litmus test for whether a process should be automated or stay manual, especially when the manual version technically works but relies on tribal knowledge? I tend towards automating a lot of things. That being primarily because I'm a developer and it's not a huge lift for me to do that, and so that tends to be the way I think about these things. But your best cases for automation are things that take a long time, are tedious, and are fairly systematic. So they work consistently every single time. That's a clear-cut case for automation. The manual case would be anything that requires a lot more nuance, context, and on-the-go decision-making. Now, I do hope that some of the agentic tools are going to make that even easier to do in an automated way, but there's still, as we talked about before, the example in collections, still an example that I'm not quite ready to hand over to an agent, at least not with the kind of ticket size we sell. So that's an example of something that I'd keep that way. So start, thinking about the process itself. Do I spend 4 hours doing the exact same thing every week to release a report? That's a great candidate for automation. Do I spend 4 hours doing a number of different things that change from week to week to solve this kind of problem? That's probably a better case for manual. And the tribal knowledge aspect of it doesn't necessarily mean automated or manual. Tribal knowledge just might mean that it's not well documented. It's not well understood what you can do. So you can always pull that knowledge out of someone's brain and get it into some kind of document so that we at least know, hey, you're going to be going through this messy manual process. It's got decision points, it's got hinges in it, but here's the kind of decisions, the kind of hinge points you're going to have in that process. All right, Lauren from Santa Monica says, what's one area most teams under-automate and one they over-automate, and why do those mistakes keep repeating across companies? Okay, I'm going to give a kind of special answer for this one, and it's actually kind of the same answer. So teams under-automate, particularly using email reporting. And especially one of my favorite things is a Monday morning batch of reports, right? What are the most important things for me, especially someone in leadership or someone managing a process, managing a department, you name it. What are the most important things I want in my inbox at 8 a.m. on a Monday? I think those are under-automated. I think a lot of teams rely on having those kind of emerge throughout the week. And it'd be amazing if at 8 a.m. on Monday, you could have all the numbers you need for the week, presumably looking back on the past week, the past month, past 90 days, whatever your reporting cycle is. So inbox at 8 a.m. Now here's where they over-automate. I think a lot of teams that decide to do this then say, and therefore we need a dashboard. And why I believe it's over-automated is because now you spend a whole lot of time on the building out of the said dashboard, which is not nearly as important as the information available at 8 a.m. on the Monday. So they tend to under-automate on just the pure, here's the information I need and when I need it. And they tend to over-automate on, we have this dedicated dashboard that we go to, as opposed to just using the inbox as a V1. Long term, you're going to want something like this to be a dashboard when you know it's something that you need to have. It's kind of like your command center. But the V1 can always be in the inbox. It can be in a spreadsheet. It can really be more immature than that, and I think that's appropriate for a long period of time. All right, so Derek from Omaha says, how do you get buy-in for new processes without forcing compliance, especially when past process initiatives have failed? The best buy-in is when you're doing something that is so genuinely useful that you don't have to force anyone to comply with it. They just really like it and it's helpful to them. Oftentimes, this is getting somebody information in a way that is much faster than they would have normally gotten it. And those processes don't take a lot for people to latch onto because they're super useful to them. So that's your best way, is do something useful and helpful for somebody, and it's genuinely so. But I think you're asking more about some of the processes that people maybe don't want to do and are happy to kind of go back to the old way or just not do it, not track it. What I do with this is, I always have a V1. I always have a draft that I'm putting out into the world and, seeing how well it goes. But, if that fails, I'm now going to go hat in hand to the leaders of the departments or the areas where this is going on and say, look, guys, here's what we tried to do. This is what we tried to have a process for. Nobody's doing it. The emails that people are supposed to respond to, the forms that they're supposed to fill out, they're not doing it. So I need you to tell me you don't like this process or what needs to change to do it. And I almost make enforcement go on them. Now they might say, at this moment often is when I get feedback, right? Oh, well, this is the one thing we don't like about it. And by the way, it's usually a small thing, right? Something that could have been changed easily, but they weren't willing to give the feedback. I'm not exactly sure why, but this is a normal human thing, which is, they'll just ignore something rather than just give you that little 5% bit of feedback. So if you could do that, then you get more buy-in from them, and because they're leaders, they feel like they're on the hook to do this kind of thing. If they really don't like the process altogether, then you could say, okay, well, this is still a problem, so what's your plan for it? And then you can put them in the driver's seat, and in a majority of those situations, people will say, you know what, actually, this might be the best way to do it, or they'll actually have a good idea too. And so I often try and, I try and do the first round of compliance myself and try and, just especially with people who report to me, obviously I'm going to be focused on their compliance. But after that, I'm trying to make sure other people are on the hook for the enforcement of this thing and just make sure that we're in this together and this isn't my pet project that I'm thrusting upon the organization. And if I am frustrated about the issue that's been created, I will make a point to point that out, right? So say, we have a process so people don't miss their expense reporting deadlines. Every time people miss their expense reporting deadlines, I'm going to be letting that manager know. Just want to let you know your team missed their expense reporting deadlines. We had a process for this. If you want to go back to it, let's take a look at that, right? So you want to make them aware of the costs that maybe are not as obvious to them, and then you want them to take ownership on this compliance side. But you have to be willing in that conversation to also take an L, right, and decide, hey, this process isn't actually working. If you come in decided that your process has to be the one and there's no way around it, then they're going to see you as aggressive and somebody that they can't work with. So you have to come in with the possibility that it won't work. But like I said, having them own that compliance task and then having them just have to feel and live the consequences is usually a good method that I've seen for dealing with these, especially on the second time around with the process initiative. All right, and now for a demonstration, we have Tanya from Richmond. So last question, can you walk through how you'd set up a pilot program for a new process? I want to see how you scope it, pick the test group, define success metrics, and decide when to roll out or roll back. And yes, I can demonstrate that. What we'll do is we'll go into Claude and we'll have Claude write up the pilot program for us just based on a couple things. And I'll come up with an idea right here that we can use. All right, so here we are in Claude, and what I'm asking it here is, I'm developing a new process for vendor onboarding that will allow our team to fast-track vendor background checks, required legal forms, and payment terms and methods, all while the team is still considering the vendor in question. What this means is we have a number of steps that need to happen the moment we decide on a vendor, and what I'd like to do is just have that stuff happening in the background as soon as they get through a certain part of our procurement process. So if we're pretty certain we're there, or if we're, say, even 60% of the way there, we might as well just collect this paperwork because there's no harm in doing it. If the team decides not to hire the vendor, I want to ensure we have a way to archive all the required info so we can ramp them up again quickly. An example here would be, hey, we really like you, but we don't need you, but we want to have all these forms ready to go so that you can just come in and join us anytime you need. If the team decides to go with the vendor, I want to make sure they have system access the Monday after the decision is made, right? So I want to make sure that they're ready to go and that we don't have a week or two of document signing and background checks and payment info, but that they're ready to go on the Monday afterward. Can you come up with a pilot program and success metrics that would allow me to test this? So I'm just taking the basic prompt to Claude and having it develop this pilot program for me. Let's see what it comes up with. All right, so let's take a look at what Claude did. So it's got an 8-week pilot here, and it has 2 to 3 departments with upcoming vendor needs. It parallels all the operational tasks, which I love too, because these are just basic requests. We can just get going through the systems, and then there's a decision. In this case, we're just either going to activate or not go, and then we'll archive everything there. And then we've got the reactivation. And we want to get to 80% or more vendors where there's parallel qualification completion rate. I really like that. Let's see here. Yeah, so we need this metric has to be 100%. Compliance, documentation, complete activation, that needs to be 100%. We can't let somebody start before they've done with that. Post-activation issues requiring remediation, less than 5% of vendors. That makes sense to me. Could be something as simple as, hey, they signed with the wrong trade name or something like that. And then everything gets archived. Yeah, I really like this. Per usual, I think Claude interpreted what I was looking for pretty well. I'm going to throw this into the show document. And then what I'm going to do now is something a little different, but we've been taking the transcripts of the show and throwing it into either Claude or ChatGPT and asking it to do a summary. I'm going to have it do like a one-pager key takeaways from this episode, the listener questions episode. and then I will put that as the last part of the episode that I'll tack onto the end. So I'm going to take this, throw this in the document, stop here, and then we'll take the transcript, throw it in, and then I'll record a last part. All right, we're back in Claude here, and I have the transcript of the first part of the episode. I just recorded a synthetic listener questions episode. I'm going to put that in quotes here. Of the Building Process podcast, can you take this transcript and give me a succinct one-pager with takeaways? Let's see what it comes up with for the succinct one-pager. All right, so Claude went really heavy on formatting here, but I got to say I do like it. So I'm actually going to throw this into the document that we have for the show, which also includes all the listener questions. But yeah, this is a really nice one-page summary, and something I think I'm just going to start doing as a general matter, especially because Claude does a really nice job with some of the formatting and getting this stuff in here. So if you like the show, there's two ways to check it out. Building Process is available at youtube.com/@buildingprocess. We got all of our episodes there. And then the Substack is where we post the podcast, and then we also post the videos inside of that as well too. Tell your friends, and do keep listening. The goal of this is to create evergreen content, and that means content that is good regardless of the tools and the era that we're going through. So much on YouTube and in podcast land these days has a half-life of maybe a day. If you listen to political news or the latest thing that's going on with Claude or ChatGPT, you'll know what I'm talking about. But building out processes and systems to run a business, to work with multiple stakeholders, to collaborate with other humans in a thoughtful way, this is timeless. And there are going to be things that continue to be timeless in terms of the way they play, along with human nature and the way we get our work done. So that's the goal of Building Process, is to have this archive, this library that is evergreen and available to you to come up with ideas, to give you the playbook, to give you the tools to build out processes in your business and your organization as well. So youtube.com/@buildingprocess and buildingprocess.substack.com. We'll see you again next week.